Hi, I'm Mike Gafa. I am the Church Leadership Development Catalyst for Luminex, and on today's whiteboard, I want to talk with you about 9 strategic planning landmines, and specifically, we're going to cover 5 of them today in part 1, and then next week we're going to cover the last 4 in part 2. So let's begin. These are things that when you're in a season of strategic planning in your church or your ministry nonprofit, these are things to avoid at all costs. They're costly. If you step on one of these, that's why we call them landmines. So stay away from these things. And the first is a lack of prayer. Now that one, I would think, would be pretty obvious. If we are people of faith, then prayer is essential. And without prayer, nothing really good is going to happen. But in my experience, what I've seen, and frankly what I've been a part of at times, is when strategic planning starts to really kick in. When we have clarity of vision and mission, the values become clear and the plans are solidified, we tend to start to go it alone. And we do a lot more on our own strength, and we go to prayer a lot less. At least that's the tendency. So to overcome the landmine of lack of prayer, there needs to be intentionality, and not just the 30-second prayer when you start meetings, that sort of thing, but make sure that prayer is central. If we're going to use the phrase that our plans have been bathed in prayer. The second landmine to avoid is a lack of faith. A lack of faith, and here again, this one is painfully obvious, but at times when we're into a planning season, if we're earnestly seeking the leading of the Holy Spirit and we're obedient to follow the Spirit's leading, there are times when our plans will be humongous. They'll be God-sized, so to speak. And in our flesh, in our humanity, when we step back from that and think about what God seems to be laying on our hearts, it can be too big, too much, too distant, and our faith can be challenged. And so we have to remain faithful. And obviously prayer and faith are intertwined, and so we need both. So we have to be in prayer, we have to exercise faithfulness and avoid lacking either one of those things. And that leads to the third landmine to avoid, which is the failure to add wisdom to faith. And what I'm talking about here is that in addition to being a person of prayer, a team of prayer, a leadership team of prayer, and of faithfulness, God has given you individually and your church leadership or nonprofit leadership team a variety of gifts and skills and experiences, and God has given you His wisdom expressed in His Word. God has given you the gift of the Holy Spirit who indwells you if you are a Christ follower, and God has even invited us to ask for wisdom. James 1:5 says to ask our God for wisdom, and our generous God will give it to us. Ask for wisdom, and our generous God will give us wisdom. So a landmine to avoid is the failure to add the wisdom that we have been given and that God invites us to bring, even situationally or request situationally, to the faith and prayerfulness that we bring. Here's the fourth landmine, and it's a big one, and that is overlooking the reality of spiritual warfare. Overlooking the reality of spiritual warfare. Because again, if you're really going to be led by the Holy Spirit, and if you're serious about following the leading of the Holy Spirit, and you're stretching out and being pliable for the Lord, you can just about be assured that there's going to be some kind of pressure and spiritual warfare that you're going to experience. And it can take a variety of different forms. It can be a heaviness. It can be looming division within the team. It can be just a feeling of we'll never see this through. But the enemy is at work when you get his attention. And one of the ways that we get the attention of the enemy is when we do and follow the leading of the Lord. And that applies to obedience as we plan as well. And then the fifth one is a failure to celebrate. A failure to celebrate. If God is at work, and I trust He is as you go through a planning process, then to not celebrate is to not acknowledge what God is doing in you and through you and your church, and the recognition and praise that it's God's work ultimately, not ours, that makes things happen. So as we think about landmines, we want to make sure that we're in prayer, that we bring faith, that we add wisdom to our faith, that we recognize the reality of spiritual warfare, and that we celebrate. And if we're intentional to do those things, then we won't step, so to speak, on the landmines of failing to do those things. That's your Whiteboard Wednesday for today. Next week, we'll look at the last 4 of the strategic planning landmines.